Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll get started on the talk. But before we start, I'd just like to state that there will be a recording of the Zoom meeting or webinar. Okay? Now, okay, so let's welcome Gigi, who's actually, we are really, really honored to have you today, especially since it's nighttime for you. Gigi is actually, I'm going to give a talk about her exploration of multilingualism and special education in US and Canada using a transdisciplinary approach. So just to give you a brief background about Gigi, she's a professor at McGill University and she completed her PhD in cognitive psychology from York University. She then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Redmond Research Institute before joining the Harvard Graduate School of Education as her first faculty position. And in January 2019, she joined the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University, and she now leads a research program that examines how diverse language experiences shape development and learning. She was an associate editor for Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, and is now an associate editor for Child Development. So without further ado, let's welcome Gigi.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for the invitation. So good morning, everyone. It's nighttime here in Montreal, but I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for waking up early and listening to what I want to share with you a little bit about my work. So my work, as Jessica mentioned, I have worked in US and also in Canada. So my research has been funded by agencies in both US and Canada. And I'm also a consultant on a number of grants here in Singapore. So it was very impressive to work with my Singaporean colleagues. Because Jessica, I've already given you a little bit of the introduction. So this slide, we can go through it a little bit more quickly. So in a nutshell, my research has three tracks of work that I kind of put them together, but also try to maintain individuality of each discipline. So I'm trained as a cognitive psychologist, and then I did some neuroscience work, and then my faculty positions are actually all in education. So in today's talk, I would be able to share a little bit with you on all three disciplines. And I can't share everything with you, but I hope I will have another time that I could come visit Singapore and have a bowl of laksa in the hawker center and share more of my work with you. Again, like I will tell you a little bit more about the work that I've done in Canada and also in the US, and I will make it very explicit that where the data is coming from, because as you know, in Singapore, you have a very different linguistic context compared to where I am in North America. And even between Canada and US, there are a lot of linguistic differences that we have to pay attention to when we think about students learning in schools. And what I'm going to give you as a talk today is actually a second part of a series of talk that I've been given. First part is more on the policy side, looking at the systemic consideration of special education in the US. It's very particular. I gave it in the beginning of March in University of Florida, Gainesville, also online. And if you're interested in learning more about that policy aspect, you can take a look at this QR code at about 55-minute mark. But of course, you can also ask me. I can also send you the link and give you a little bit more information. And so for today's talk, I kind of tailored it a little bit to thinking about the linguistic context. And as much as I want to tell you that I have answers for a lot of the questions that we have as researchers, as educators, unfortunately, I don't think I can give you clear answers. But I hope at the end of the talk, we will have some consensus about how linguistic experience and the language context, especially instructional language, changes how we see multilingual children learning in general education and also a little bit about special education. So contextualizing experiences is a very key focus of my research. In the United States, there was no federal official language, even though English is spoken everywhere, like the lingua franca. At the point when I prepared this set of talks, there was no federal official language, but in the beginning of March, the current president actually signed an executive order making English as the official language. I think if you want to talk about what's the ramification of making English as an official language of a country, we can talk about that. But I am not going to change my slide. I'm just going to say that there was no official language, but as of March, now we have an official language in the United States. And since I mentioned that English is the lingua franca, then in most of the schools in the US, the dominant instructional language is also English. And a lot of the children are multilingual because they speak another language at home, but they're not necessarily multiliterate because they don't learn to read the non-English language at school. And this occurs even for children who speaks a language every single day with their family, but they may not be able to read. Now, where I am in Canada, it's slightly different. In Canada, we're federally bilingual, having English and French as the official languages, but not as many as in Singapore, where you have 4 official languages. And in Canada, even though we have 2 official languages, there's a lot of provincial differences. I'm currently in the province of Quebec, and in Quebec, French is the official language, meaning that when you go out to any government business, to do government business or go see a doctor, it is expected to use French. And English is a minority in this province. But across Canada, English and French are taught in many schools, and immersion schools are also very prevalent in English and French, but the quality varies a lot. So if you're interested in this line of work, I can also share a couple of readings with you. And so in Canada, we have many children and family members who are multilingual, and they're also partially multiliterate. A lot of them would be literate in English and French because they learn to read these 2 languages at school, but not necessarily in the heritage language that they speak at home. So I hope I differentiated the 2 linguistic contexts here. And so in today's talk, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of, I would call a non-linear roadmap, meaning that one point does not necessarily pass on to the next point because a lot of it are intertwined and related to each other. And I'm hoping that by the end of the talk, you would try to think with me about what is the value of doing work in multiple disciplines. And so I'll first start off with multilingualism and special education in the US, just give an overview. And then I'll dive into how diverse language experiences and learning affect children's learning outcome in terms of reading. And finally, we will think a little bit about what are the other methods that will help us to think about when a bilingual or multilingual child struggle to learn to read. Does this child need more time to learn the second or additional language, or does this child need special education services? And so just to give you an overview, in the 20s, about 100 years ago, we do have some research that frame multilingualism as an inferiority. And particularly in Sayers' article, he stated that this inferiority actually becomes greater and greater for children from 7 to 11 years of age. And this is the time when terms like mental confusion come about to describe multilingual children and their learning capacity. Fast forward a little bit in the 30s, about 10 years later, in the United States, the researcher Manuel compares Spanish-speaking children to English-speaking children. So in this graph here, you see the 2 lines that I highlighted as Spanish-speaking children. Their academic performance across age are consistently lower than those who speak English. And what you see as almost a diagonal line is the age norm with the children who are speaking English as their only language. And it is also in this article that you see a term like language handicap shows up to tell us a little bit more about at that time, how was multilingualism perceived? Now, this is almost 100 years ago. But what about today? Like, what do we know about today? So I'm hoping in today's talk, you will see a little bit more about what we see as today. And I think I'm not trying to say that these research are invalid, because all research are stepping on our predecessors' shoulder. But time has changed and multilingualism has become much more prevalent than the old days. And we don't always have to compare children who speak multiple languages to children who only speak one language as a monolingual norm. And particularly in education, in the US, it's actually quite interesting that even though we care about who are multilingual, bilingual, or monolingual, multilingualism is actually not the focus in education in the US, at least. Instead, there are a lot of terminology that describe children who are multilingual, depending on who is in power, what are the focus. Some of these terms focus on the limited or developing English capacity, such as limited English proficient, or English as a second language. Other terms focus more on whether they are learning English in the process of learning English. But to be honest with you, I think even monolingual speaking children, they are still learning English at every single point in the developmental stage. So a lot of these labels are, they might describe the similar characteristics of the student, but all the commonality is that these children speak another language on top of English. And in the education system, they also focus a lot more on deciding whether children are English proficient or not. And therefore, we have this binary category of proficient in English or not. Versus in research, we focus more on children who are speaking multiple languages versus those who only speak one. And very interestingly, recently, there is also a lot more children that we observe in the US education system who are multilingual but are also English proficient. And so these might be children who were born in the United States or have been developing English to the point that the school system decide that they are now becoming proficient. So all of this complexity actually don't usually review in the policy or national statistics. In the US, we see a lot more statistics focusing on English learners. So English learners are children who are in the process of learning English while they speak a first or dominant language, or in Singapore, I think you use the term mother tongue. And here's a map that shows you where the concentration of English learners are across the country. They are about 10% of the population, and the majority of them are born in the US, whereas Spanish is the most representative language among English learners. A lot of them concentrate on urban elementary schools, and they have very high dropout rate at the high school. And in some states, they recognize gifted education, and in those states, English learners are often underidentified. And very often they're from low resource or low income background. And importantly, they're often misrepresented in special education contexts. And we'll look into this point a little bit more. So I told you in the US that multilingualism is often associated with socio-demographic factors. And so one thing we could do is to look at state level data. So using statistics from 2019, data set that is before COVID, we're going to look at third grade to fifth grade data. And I think also have data from grade 8. And so at the state level, the sample size is not trivial. We have over 200,000 children in this sample. And according to the state level data, we can divide them into 4 groups. The first group is include children whose first language is English. and their parents reported these information when they register into the school system. And then the other children who don't speak English as the first language, some of them have never needed English language, so they're been English speaking proficient English when they started school. And some of them needed English service before, but they get reclassified and become former English learners. And then finally, we have children who are currently learning English as a language and were deemed as not proficient enough to learn in a classroom. So as I mentioned to you, in the school system, very often these group in the green box are compared to the current English learners because they looked at the comparison between those who are proficient versus those who are not. But in fact, these three groups of children seems to have more commonality across them because they don't speak English as a first language, but they have varying degree or proficiency in English, which is an additional language that they're learning. So using data like this, we can then just do a very simple analysis. This is work led by Brianna Yamasaki and at Emory University. And so we looked at the proportion of children who are coming from economic disadvantaged background, which is highlighted in the pink, versus those who are not, okay? And in the third grade data here, we can see that majority of the children who have never received English service actually are from a not economic disadvantaged background, versus those children who had a need to learn English as a second language. A majority of them actually from the economic disadvantaged background. So you may say, okay, this is only third grade data. What about the other grades? So we looked at fifth grade and also looked at eighth grade. And it turns out that the pattern is the same. And we have also published some of these data in a paper in 2018 using data earlier. So over time, the pattern of the results have not changed much. So that will tell you that proportion of students who need English service are also disproportionately more of them coming from the economic disadvantaged background, which is an indicator of low resource or low income. And so whether this issue, the language issue, also confound with special education is something that we also looked at. And I worked on this project with my colleague, Jeanette Mencia Martinez and Minyu Ho. And we were very fortunate. We get state level data from a southeastern state for 10 years. So on this graph here, we have data from 2009 to 2019. And on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, we have the odds ratio, which is the likelihood of a child being identified for special education. And then we looked at three groups of children. First, we have children who speak English as a native language. Then we have English proficient bilinguals. And we have current English learners. So remember, I told you there's a lot of misrepresentation of children who speak English as a second language in special education. So the black line, the native English speakers are our control group. So their odd ratio is always at 1. And if you look at the blue line, they're almost always under identify across time, across the 10-year span. And then you look at the orange one, like, oh, they seem to be okay because they're quite comparable to children who speak English as the native language. Now, if that's the case, maybe we are looking at the special education data as a whole that may not reveal the real pattern. So the next thing we do is to look at the same three groups of children, but in 5 high incidence disability categories. So I am going to show you now the 2 categories that are more, or I would say more or less, relying on language. The first one is specific learning disabilities, and the second one is speech or language impairment. I'm not very familiar with the special education context in Singapore, but maybe you can let me know whether these categories are also in the Singapore education system. And in this case, if English as a second language is not an issue in identifying for special education, we should not see the three lines to be as different from each other. But in fact, if you look at specific learning disabilities and speech or language impairments, we see the orange line, which indicates the current English learners. Those are children who are in the process of improving their English to a proficient level. There are a number of years that they're consistently higher, but the English proficient bilingual children are consistently lower. Okay, now let's take a look at three categories that are not relying on language as much. And these three categories are intellectual disabilities, other health impairments, and autism. And just a note that ADHD actually falls under other health impairment here. And for these three categories, the English proficient bilinguals and the current English learners are consistently lower, except for in the intellectual disability group, they are the English learners are quite comparable to the native English speakers. So then maybe this is only one state data that we looked at across the 10-year span. So we also compared with the national statistics, and it turns out that in the school year of 2020 to 2021, English learners are over represented in the specific learning disability category compared to the general education children who are not English learners. So they're more likely to be identified with specific learning disability and speech or language impairment, which are the two categories that I showed, but also under-identified in other special education categories. So what we know so far from a very brief overview of the special education context in the United States and children who are learning English as an additional language is that multilingualism is really complex and heavily intertwined with systemic factors such as socioeconomic status. And special education eligibility and identification are actually modulated by multilingualism and SES intertwined. And multilingualism is differentially represented, or I would say misrepresented, in different special education categories. And they're over-identified in language-related categories, but under-identified in other categories. So that's what we know so far from high-level policy-level data. And importantly, what we know, there's individual differences. Not all multilinguals are the same, in such that English proficiency, depending on where you are, actually mitigates some of these identification issues in special education. So that's a very brief, quick overview in, I think, about 10 minutes about the American special education context. So next, we're going to look at diverse language experiences from all of these children and how does it affect learning. Now, what a line of work that I do a lot is to look at the within individual contextual differences, which I'll give you an example. So when we think about language acquisition, think of a child who is learning a language at home. Home language exposure is actually the key, the main source of input. And a lot of colleagues at NTU, especially at NIU, are experts in this area. And so home language exposure is very dynamic. So for example, I wouldn't say to my child that, okay, we're now going to talk about weather in English, or we're going to talk about the bus system in Cantonese. Cantonese is my home language. And also at home, when you talk to your child, a lot of the communication is very opportunistic. There is no fixed amount of language that you use. You just go with the flow. And sometimes we mix two languages. Sometimes we use even more than the language repertoire that we have to talk to each other, depending on who is in the family. So between my child and I, we often talk in English, but if my mom is here, then we might switch to Cantonese a little bit more. And sometimes we might even try to use French because we just try to practice our French. And so at home, there's a lot of variable input in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, and it is expected that we have variable outcome from children because of all of these linguistic diversity happening at home. Now let's switch gear a little bit to think about literacy learning. So literacy instruction is typically happening at school. And at school, we have collective learning experience, meaning that children are receiving structured, purposeful instruction for them to reach a certain level of competence. And in this case, relative to the home language environment at school, the input is a little bit more consistent because it's coming from a teacher, or there is a fixed amount of time that you're exposed to a language. Yet we still observe a variable outcome, but the variability in outcome is less than that we see in the school. So now I told you a lot about what's happening at home and what's happening at school. And research also shows us that when we looked at a capacity that reflects home language acquisition, it's often shown that multilingual children may possess a smaller set of vocabulary compared to their monolingual counterparts, but that's only in one language. But in terms of language learning, such as learning how to read the words, very often multilingual children and monolingual children are similar, have similar performance, but very rarely are the same studies actually look at these two capacity in the same child. So when I started to think about these cross-contextual differences, I started to look into my own data sets and think, oh, maybe I can see if I can find some evidence in my home data sets. And if my hypothesis is correct, what we should see is the well-established finding in the literature that multilingual children know fewer words in one of their languages compared to their monolingual peers, but they should have very comparable performance in capacities such as reading a word in the language of an instruction compared to their monolingual peers because they share the same learning environment. So I looked into a first data set that I collected in Boston. I told you already that we should see a difference between groups, and this is a set of teenagers, 11 to 15. We gave them a task looking at the vocabulary, and it shows that the bilingual children who speak Spanish as their first language and English as a second language have smaller vocabulary in English. But when we looked at their word learning capacity, word reading capacity, there's no difference. And then you may say, okay, these are teenagers, so maybe they already know how to read a lot of the words. So maybe we should look at younger groups. Coming to Canada, so I wanted to push it a little bit further. We have children and also adolescents. Okay, and in terms of the children, they're 6 to 9 years old, and the adolescents is 12 to 15. They're all from different multilingual homes. Almost all of them are educated in both French and English in varying degree. These are online data collected during COVID. And then we compare the children versus the adolescents. And it turns out that with an age group difference. So that's good because for all the data that are collected during COVID, we want to make sure that is valid. So it shows that the teenagers know more words than the children. That's great. But remember, in Canada, in my community here in Montreal, it's actually really hard to find monolingual children. So almost everybody speaks two languages in this sample, but we can look at those children who speak English as a first language versus those who don't. And in this case, we also have a group difference in picture vocabulary. Okay, so replicating what I found in Boston. Again, we don't expect to see learning differences in word reading, because the children should share the same environment. And keep in mind that these are the same children. And again, we have an age group difference. Teenagers were able to read more words than children, but we don't have a language group difference anymore. So the children who speak English as a first language are not reading more words than children who speak other language as the first language. Okay, 2 data sets, similar findings. These are the same children, but I'm still skeptical. So I'm going to look into the longitudinal evidence. I was involved in a study that started off following children from age 3 to 3rd grade and 4th grade. And something happened in 2020 that affected all of us. We lost 3 waves of data, but we were able to follow them with 4 waves, at least 4 waves of data from kindergarten to 3rd grade. And this is longitudinal, and it's not a trivial sample. We have 625 children whom we followed from kindergarten to 3rd grade, roughly half of them coming from Spanish-English bilingual homes. The other half comes from English-only homes. And they're all from low-income homes in a city located in south-central US. And by low income, we meant that they are federally and at the state level as well, determined to be from low resource background. And we gave them standardized assessment on language and literacy. And here I'm going to show you the raw score, which reflects the typical numbers of correct responses between the basal and the ceiling items. And you may wonder why I'm not using standard score. I can tell you that story at another time, because that is a whole presentation by itself. So let's take a look at this very large sample, longitudinal data, including COVID. So I told you already that if home linguistic diversity has variable input, then we should also expect variable outcome in these children. And we replicated what people typically report in the literature. Children who speak English as a first language, they have a larger vocabulary in English than children who speak Spanish as the first language. And this difference is persistent since the fall of kindergarten all the way to spring of 3rd grade, including the COVID time. But when we looked at the differences in word learning, remember, these are the same children and they're sharing the same classrooms. A lot of them are going to the same schools, and some of them are even in the same classroom. There was only a slight difference in kindergarten because the sample size is large. So we see a slight statistically significant difference at kindergarten. But then as they go along, they started to merge. And after COVID, they are overlapping on each other. There was absolutely no difference whatsoever in the English words they can read. And so with this set of data, now I finally convinced myself that I think I'm onto something here, that the theory of change of multilingualism is different for the different capacity that we looked at. For language capacity that are mostly related to the diversity at home in terms of exposure, we expect to see differences. But for abilities that are not related to that kind of diversity, because children are sharing the same learning environment, we should not see a difference. And coupled with some of the follow-up work that we've been doing, my former doctoral student, Sibila Leon Cordero, we looked at reading comprehension in adolescents, and it turns out that a lot of people think if you're better in one language, you may be worse in another language. And it turns out it's not the case. So learning multiple languages is not like playing on a seesaw. It turns out that if you're better in speaking Spanish or reading in Spanish, especially when you read a challenging task, such as with very complex clause structures in the passages, then you're also better in reading English. So this relationship, the cross-language positive influence is shown not only in behavior, but also in eye tracking in the paper that we published earlier. So what we know so far is that language differences observed in multilinguals are primarily due to the diverse language exposure in the environment, not learning differences. And there's no reason to believe that learning capacity is lower in multilingual children, unlike the researchers reported about 100 years ago. But how do we differentiate additional language acquisition from learning difficulty? And so now I'm going to show you an exploratory study that we had done in the US. In this study, we have 3 groups of children. Those who are typical readers but speak Spanish as a first language, those who are atypical reader but speak English as a first language, and those who are typical reader but speak English as a first language. And you may wonder, why don't I have a group with L1 Spanish but atypical? And the reason why I decided not to include that group is because there is no way for us to determine whether a child is genuinely needing special education or is developing reading atypically, because there is currently no resource for us to determine that. And that is exactly the answer we're trying to get. And remember, I showed you that the samples with different language experience, also from very different socioeconomic background. And we found the same thing in our sample, meaning that our sample is very representative of the population where we draw our data from. And based on the simple views of reading as a model, in which Hoover and Gould postulated that word recognitions and the product between word recognition and language comprehension, we need both of them to be high in order to have successful reading comprehension. And word recognition here refers to the ability to read words, like some of the tasks that I showed you before. Language comprehension refers to the capacity to understand spoken language. And these 2 components has to be high and successful in order to acquire a high level of reading comprehension. Now, based on this framework, we might say, okay, that might be a good framework, but is it appropriate for adolescents? So we did a study comparing whether the contribution of language comprehension in multilingual children is the same as those in adolescents, because I'm going to show you data from the adolescents group, and it turns out that the model is still meaningful for adolescents, but the contribution is slightly less. So there is some developmental differences, but the model is largely applicable to adolescents. And so with the 3 groups, we confirmed the group identification such that in the picture vocabulary, the 3 groups have significant differences among each. And for the L1 Spanish speaking children, we also have the Spanish speaking data. In the letter word ID, the Spanish speaking children and the English speaking children are comparable, with the children who are atypical readers have the lowest performance. Whereas in terms of passage comprehension, the Spanish speaking children and the English speaking atypical readers are comparable, and they're both performing lower than the English typical readers groups. So we confirmed the group affiliation behaviorally, and we also looked at the speech production. So in this task, what we did was have them watch a video and then tell us what they have learned from the video, and then we code the linguistic structure in the speech output. And it turns out that there's no group difference. So in terms of the quality, the microstructure of their speech, the children are all comparable. The only difference is in the moving window type token ratio between the Spanish speaking children and the English speaking children. So we have only some differences. And the reason why we did this is to ensure that when we assess the children's learning in this study, we are actually looking at their speech production, not in terms of writing or reading, because we know the children who are atypical reader will struggle with that. So what we know so far is the bilingual children do not learn less than monolingual children when their learning environment is shared. And there are differentiable component skills between bilingual children and children with reading difficulties, such that in the word recognition, which is a core issues with children with reading difficulty, is unique and that we don't see it in bilingual children. And whereas in bilingual children, because of the diversity of their language exposure, we see that they're slightly lower in their performance, and both of which could have an impact on their reading comprehension. So then, why do we need a transdisciplinary research program to answer these very complex questions? I chose neuroscience just because I had the background and capacity. And very often in neuroscience research, we have the good understanding of how learning occurs, but we don't know how neuroscience and learning occurs in the context of education. And in this case, neuroscience can actually have a lot of potential to tell us what we don't know by comparing behavior. What I've shown you so far, even in my own research, is to compare behavior between groups. And in this case, if we step away from relative comparison, we may actually understand the underlying mechanisms of each group and children with different characteristics and how did they manifest into the behavior that we see as an outcome. And furthermore, we also can formulate or frame a research program inspired by educational challenge, like what I told you. When a multilingual child struggles to learn to read, how do we know that this child just needs more time to learn to read in that language, in the developing language, or this child genuinely needs special education service? And one challenge that we have is in neuroscience, the method is often quite hard to make an ecological relevant, because when we lie in a scanner without moving for 45 minutes, it's nothing like how we learn in classroom. But we can formulate what we do in the scanner in order to tell us a little bit about the mechanisms. And so we devised a protocol in which we asked children and also adults, we did this in adults as well, what they know about earth science. And we decided that earth science is actually a topic that most people are interested in because we live in a planet Earth. And we extracted Massachusetts curriculum to devise a video that we produce ourselves with a speaker on one side and information on the other side. And we show this video to the children while they're in the scanner. And then when they come out, we ask them questions. And we ask them to tell us what they have learned so that we can code their microstructure in their speech. And we also ask them to answer some very specific questions to gauge at their comprehension. And in this case, it's shown that the children who speak Spanish as the first language and the atypical readers who are doing a task that is entirely in spoken language are actually performing similarly in terms of comprehension, both of which are slightly lower than the English typical reader. And using this information, I'm going to skip this slide so I can actually get to what I want to show you, but we can talk about this after the presentation. So Sibylla, my former students, are interested in the brain areas that is essentially responsible for sequencing X. It's in the left inferior frontal area. And using a seat functional connectivity analysis, we can see in the two groups, the L1 English-speaking children and L1 Spanish-speaking children. And if I'm going to rotate the animation, you will see that the children who speak Spanish as the first language, when they're learning in English, it uses more different areas of the brain. So the connectivity of this area in the front part of the brain is much broader. So there's a lot more connections and activities going on in a correlating fashion in this area. And similarly, we also looked at another area in the left medial temporal gyrus. And in this case, we found very similar results, that in the L1 English-speaking children, they mostly have activities in one side of the hemisphere, whereas the children who are learning in their second language use both sides of the brain. Now, remember I told you that we also have the small group of children who were struggling with reading, but we cannot include them in the paper that we publish because the sample size is really, really small. If you want to know why the sample size is so small, it's not because we're slacking and not collecting enough information. It's because there's a lot of challenges, including those children in an MRI study. But ultimately, we did have these children in the sample, and I'm going to show you the brain activation here. And interestingly, for the children who are atypical readers speaking English as a first language, their functional connectivity pattern is in between the children who's speaking English as a second language and also speaking English as a first language. So it's our interpretation is that even when they are learning new materials in a modality that typically do not show a deficit, they are still struggling. And so what we need to answer this big question is a transdisciplinary approach, meaning that we really need people who can step outside of their comfort zone and listen and work with people in different disciplines. In this case, I showed you an example where I am from psychology, neuroscience, and education that connect all these different circles together. But I'm only one person, and I only have 24 hours. We need more people who do this so that we learn from each other and also have the potential to connect with each other to create what I call hybridized knowledge, meaning that knowledge that is not only from one single discipline, but is inspired by practical challenge. And so that we can bring different disciplines together, generate a knowledge that is actually applicable, and we can bring it back to practice or policy. So what are some of the questions that we could ask from this? There are four main lines of research in my lab. First is, how do second language acquisition and literacy learning manifest in children, adolescents, and adults? How do they differ across these developmental stages in terms of behavior, in terms of their brain connectivity? And what are the classroom or pedagogical features that facilitate learning, especially for those who don't speak the instructional language as their first language? How do we sensitively, equitably, and reliably identify bilingual children who may benefit from special education? This is a really core question that we are hoping to answer in an ongoing project, also in the United States. And finally, this line of work, I haven't been able to fit it in to show you, but how do the cascading effects of perceived value of language diversity leads to differential developmental and learning outcomes? So as adults in a community, the mere perceived value of an attribute like multilingualism actually changes the immediate environment of the children who lived in, and therefore also have cascading effects on the developmental outcome and learning outcomes. So I know it's a lot, but if you can only remember one thing in today's talk, remember that transdisciplinary research is very important and very valuable in answering complex questions, especially when we consider a multilingual child in the intersection of family, school, and community, and how these individuals interact with his or her environment. And this type of work cannot be completed without support. And I have a lot of colleagues, students to help me out here, and also the funding agencies that actually make all the work happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigi, for such an insightful talk. I think now we have we already have a few questions, if I'm not wrong. So
Oh,
yeah, okay. So there's one on the Q&A.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you accept
Should
that?
I, like, I don't know what you guys see. Should I stop sharing so we can see each other?
That works.
Or
So
should
we actually see your screen right now. So it's just thank you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. If I stop share that, you will see my desktop is a very messy desktop. So let's just stay with the thank you slide. All right. If it's okay, I'm just gonna read out the question in the Q&A and then I can provide a response.
Okay.
So the question asked, would acquisition of working language such as English enables disadvantaged children in third world country, developing country, and children who are first and second generation migrants in English dominant speaking country? Um, so to parse out this question a little bit, I'm curious as to whether this is about speaking the societal dominant language is going to help them and leverage them. And the answer is definitely yes. Now, I come from the capacity, I come from a discipline where I'm a very optimistic person, and I myself speak English as a second language. And it seems like I'm always living in a place where I'm always a language minority, if you may. So I grew up in Hong Kong a little bit. I actually lived in Singapore when I was a child. I lived in Clementi. I don't know if you guys know the neighborhood. Of course, you know the neighborhood. So I lived in Clementi when I was young. And at that time, I speak Cantonese with my parents, and my mom sent me to the Japanese school, and I know not a single word of Japanese, and I still went to school. And then I moved to Canada, and I was like working up to improve my English, and then US, and then now I'm in Montreal, where French is the major language. When now at the point that English is my more dominant and more fluent language. Um, but now I have to learn French. And so I think to answer your question, if a child has the opportunity to speak a societal dominant language on top of the heritage language, I think it's always a good thing. Now, whether it's going to be an upward mobility, economic mobility for these children, I think it depends on a lot of factors. I know there are books published saying that this could be the case, but I think it also depends on how much systemic help these children have. So language is only one thing. It will help them, but can only help them so much, right? And so the second part of the question is, would language acquisition bring these children to the same starting line for further education? Yes. So my answer would be yes. Not only English, but all the societal language. If you move to a country where there are languages that you need to acquire, like coming here, then I will just have to learn French. And it is not an easy thing at my age, I have to share, but it's not impossible. So in any chance, if we have an opportunity to equip children with more knowledge, more capacity in terms of the linguistics capital, I would say, like I consider them a capital, then it's always a good thing. But of course, this should not be done at the expense of their heritage language, in which they communicate with their culture, their identity, and their family members. I hope that answers your question. And then I see that there's another question in the chat. Okay, given the multilingual context of Canada and US, I'm struck by a comment that support for the development of non-EL as L1 student is considered special ed support. This is not considered as special ed support. Special education are actually coming from a law called IDEA that is designed to protect the right of the children who need special education service. So this is not the same as providing English service, but it is a fine line. And from a policy viewpoint, how much should language instruction already assume that the children are working with multiple languages while acquiring English language as the L1 working language and medium of instruction? So I think the person who are asking this question, I think it's Danielle. How much should language instruction already assume that students are working with multiple languages? So in the education system, I don't think we should assume. So for example, I told you that in the education system, typically children who are proficient in English are contrasted with children who are not proficient in English. Now, in that case, there's also the assumption for the children who are proficient in English, just because these children only speak English in their entire life doesn't necessarily mean that they are proficient in English. And how do you define proficient in all the children in a classroom of children who are all learning a language, right? So I would perceive that multilingualism is a spectrum, is a continuum across different levels of proficiency. It's a natural variability of ability in terms of language. And so if the how much should language instruction already assumed that students are working with multiple languages? I won't assume. So I think in this case, it will be more productive to have timely and meaningful assessment at different point to see where children are at in a single classroom to facilitate instructions, particularly those pertaining to language. And the good thing about language instruction is that you don't only have to do it in language class. You can build it into different content. You can build it into different activities depending on the age group of the children. And I think that is the key of not assuming, but but embracing what students brings to the classroom, because diversity is part of what they bring into the classroom, but work with that diversity instead of seeing the diversity as a challenge. Okay, Darren. Darren says, from the slides, children learning two languages are using both sides of the brain. Is this to be interpreted as a strength or struggle during the learning process? Excellent questions, Darren. The way that I interpreted it is not so much as whether a strength or a struggle, is how they adapt to the demand of learning in a language that they may not have a lot of repertoire in their mind. So in the current study that we're working on, we're actually, okay, let me back up. So the video that I share with you show that children who are learning in their second language have a lot more connectivity in the brain, right? In both sides of the brain instead of just in one side, like the children who only speak English. One question that I've often get after we publish a study is that what if you show the children the same materials in Spanish? And my answer is always as we don't know, because we didn't do that. So now here in Montreal, we are doing a study giving adults, not kids, because it's very hard to find kids to do MRI study here. We are looking at adults who are English and French bilingual, and some of them may be multilingual as well. And we give them two sets of videos, one in English and one in French, and they have a variability in English and French. So we're now going to look at exactly the question that Darren asked, which is in terms of their effort, in terms of their brain connectivity, and the dominant versus the non-dominant language, and whether that makes a difference in their learning outcome. So I wouldn't say it's a strength or a struggle. I think it's their adaptation to the task.
Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for just one more question because we don't want to hold Gigi up too late into the night. Okay, I think there aren't any more questions. Thank you so much, Gigi, for actually staying up and doing this very, very insightful talk for us.
Not a problem. Thank you. And hopefully I will come back to Singapore next time and go to my favorite places are the, what do you call, the kopitiam?
Kopitiam. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we hope to see you in Singapore.
All right. Have a good day, guys. Thank you. Bye.
You have a good night. See you.
Thank you, Jessica.